Judge Grayson thought he was just dealing with another unprepared teen, unaware that the young defendant was about to turn the courtroom upside down. The atmosphere inside the Los Angeles County Courthouse felt heavy, like the air was thick enough to suffocate. Spectators lined the gallery, whispering among themselves as the drama began to unfold. The defendant, standing at his table, seemed too small for the vast space around him. His hands were in his pockets, chin lifted just enough to show he wasn't intimidated. Jalen Dawson, 19, stood accused of grand theft auto and resisting arrest. The charges were serious, but the look Judge Walter Grayson gave him suggested the real battle had little to do with the law. Grayson leaned back in his chair, drumming his fingers lazily against the desk, gazing down at Jalen over the rim of his glasses. A smirk played at the corners of his mouth. "You think you're some kind of legal expert?" Grayson's voice was laced with dry amusement. "This isn't a debate club, kid." A ripple of laughter spread through the room. The bailiff, the stenographer, even the prosecutor. They were all in on the joke. But Jalen didn't flinch. He wasn't laughing. He'd been preparing for this moment, not exactly this one, but a moment like it. Years spent studying the law, not to become a defendant, but to understand how it worked. He'd memorized case law while others memorized sports stats. While friends played video games, he practiced mock trials in his head, arguing cases with himself. His mother, Denise Dawson, had worked as a paralegal for over 20 years, and Jalen had absorbed everything she brought home: the shortcuts prosecutors took, the biases judges held, the defense attorneys who didn't fight. By 14, he could break down a trial better than most law students. But Grayson didn't care about that. To him, Jalen was just another troublemaker. Grayson sighed and flipped through the case file. "Let's make this quick," he said. "I have a golf game at 2. The gallery chuckled again, but this time, something shifted. Jalen's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smirk. Grayson had just made his first mistake, though no one else had noticed yet. The prosecutor, Mitchell Carrington, rose with the confidence of someone who believed the case was already won. His suit was crisp, tie perfectly knotted, his voice carrying the rehearsed air of someone who had delivered this same speech countless times. "Your Honor, the state will prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant, Jalen Dawson, was caught in a stolen 2022 Audi ASIX, reported missing just hours before his arrest. Officers pursued him through downtown, where he allegedly attempted to flee before being apprehended. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The evidence speaks for itself." The weight of his words settled over the room, and the gallery buzzed with murmurs. On the surface, it sounded like an open and shut case, a stolen car, a chase, an arrest. But Jalen wasn't buying it. He'd seen this play before. Grayson glanced at Jalen, then turned back to Carrington. "Go on," he said. Carrington walked toward the jury box, his shoes clicking sharply on the floor. "The defense may try to convince you that this was all a misunderstanding, that Mr. Dawson is some unfortunate victim of circumstance." He locked eyes with Jalen for the first time. "But let's be honest. What kind of victim runs from the police?" The tension in the room thickened. Jalen didn't blink. "Your Honor," Carrington continued, flipping through his papers, "I have the testimony of Officer Daniel Ruiz, who personally witnessed the defendant behind the wheel before he attempted to flee. The car was confirmed stolen, the arrest made by the book." Grayson nodded, exhaling sharply. "Sounds straightforward to me." To most, the case probably did seem straightforward. A stolen car, a chase, an arrest. But Jalen had spent too many years studying the law to not see the cracks. He stayed silent, watching, waiting. "All right, let's hear the defense's response," Grayson said, turning to Jalen's lawyer, Lisa Thornton, who had barely spoken since entering the courtroom. She stood, nervously. "My client." But Jalen placed a hand on her arm, signaling for her to sit down. And for the first time, he spoke. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor." The room went silent. Grayson stared, clearly amused. "You'll what?" Jalen's voice was calm and steady. "I'll be defending myself." A murmur rippled through the room. The bailiff raised his eyebrows. Carrington let out a sharp laugh, but no one was laughing when Jalen took his first step forward. The weight of the courtroom seemed to settle around him. He stood, hands still in his pockets, letting the silence stretch until it was almost uncomfortable. Finally, he spoke. "Your Honor, before I begin, I'd like to confirm something with the prosecution." Carrington raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. "Go ahead." Jalen stepped forward, slow and deliberate. "You said Officer Daniel Ruiz personally saw me behind the wheel before I was arrested, correct?" Carrington exhaled sharply. "That's right." "And that testimony is written in his report?" "Of course it is." Jalen nodded and turned to Grayson. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence." Grayson frowned. "On what grounds?" Jalen pulled his hands from his pockets for the first time and gestured toward the prosecution's table. "Because Officer Ruiz never saw me in that car. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the chase began." Carrington's face flickered with confusion. "What are you talking about?" Jalen took another step forward. "Your Honor, if the court allows me, I'd like to submit a request to verify Officer Ruiz's GPS logs from that night. If his report says he witnessed me in the vehicle, then it should match his location history. But I have a feeling it won't." The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Grayson glanced at Carrington, who cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "That report was filed by an officer of the law," Carrington snapped. "Are we really going to take the word of a defendant over a trained professional?" Jalen shrugged casually. "If the officer was where he claimed to be, then the GPS data will prove it. But if he wasn't?" He let the sentence hang in the air. Grayson turned to Carrington. "Does the prosecution have any issue with verifying the officer's GPS logs?" Carrington hesitated. The pause was long enough for the jury, the gallery, and the judge to notice. Jalen let out a quiet breath. "No objections, Your Honor," Carrington finally said. But the shift had already begun. The courtroom wasn't laughing anymore. The tension was palpable. Carrington, his confidence cracking, shuffled through his papers. "Your Honor, while we wait for the GPS records, the fact remains that the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle." Jalen nodded. "That's true." He took a step forward. "But let's talk about that evidence." Grayson raised an eyebrow, signaling for him to continue. Jalen turned to the jury. "The prosecution wants you to believe that finding my fingerprints in a car means I stole it. But let's think about this logically. Let's say you walk into a department store, try on a jacket, and put your hands in the pockets. Later, someone steals that jacket. Would your fingerprints on it mean you stole it?" A few jurors exchanged glances. The gallery murmured. Jalen didn't give them time to recover. The car was parked outside a 7-Eleven hours before the alleged theft. "I was inside the store with 3 friends. Yes, when we walked past the car, I leaned against it. I even opened the door because it was unlocked. But I didn't take it, didn't drive it, didn't steal anything from inside. Just a dumb moment of curiosity." He let the word settle, then asked, "Does touching something make you a criminal?" Carrington cleared his throat, flipping through his notes, scrambling to find something to regain control. But Jalen wasn't finished. "And while we're on the topic, let's talk about how that fingerprint analysis was done." He turned to Grayson. "Your Honor, was the forensic specialist from this case subpoenaed to testify?" Grayson blinked, caught off guard. He glanced at Carrington, who hesitated before admitting, "No." Jalen's lips pressed together. "So let me get this straight. The state is using forensic evidence to try and convict me, but they didn't think it was necessary to bring in the actual specialist who processed that evidence. No chance for me to cross-examine, ask about the chain of custody, or challenge the accuracy. Carrington's jaw tightened, but Jalen nodded like it was all he needed to hear. Grayson sighed, rubbing his temple. It was the look of a man realizing the case wasn't going as smoothly as he thought. Jalen wasn't done yet. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence an official statement from the owner of the vehicle. Grayson frowned. The owner? Jalen nodded. Yes, Mr. Raymond Whitaker, the registered owner of the stolen Audi, provided a statement to the police that was never submitted in the prosecution's filings. And I think I know why. Carrington's jaw clenched. Jalen didn't wait for him to respond. He pulled out a printed transcript from his file and read aloud. I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off, but it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid and he was white. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Jalen held the paper up. That's from the original police report. The same report the prosecution conveniently never mentioned.